Soldiers, behold the eagle. It soars as our empire shouts. Our destiny awaits.
The most dangerous general in history never fought a fair battle, not once. Every engagement he won, and he won all of them, was decided before the first sword was drawn. His enemies always outnumbered him. His enemies always had better supply lines, better territory, better political support. And his enemies always lost, not because they were cowards, not because they were bad soldiers, but because by the time they realized what was happening, they were already inside a trap they had no idea existed. The Romans knew this about him. They knew it after the Second River. They would know it again, far more catastrophically, after Lake Trasimene and Cannae. But it is the Trebia River, December 218 BC, a frozen morning in northern Italy, where the blueprint first appeared in its complete form, where a man named Hannibal Barca proved to the most militarily disciplined civilization in the Western world that discipline, without understanding, is just a more organized way to die. What makes Trebia different from everything else is not the casualty count. 20,000 Romans killed in 6 hours is staggering, but Cannae would be worse. What makes Trebia remarkable is how completely invisible the trap was. The Romans walked into it awake. They walked into it with professional soldiers who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of engagement. They walked into it with a consul who had studied Hannibal's recent movements and believed he understood what he was dealing with. He understood nothing. And by noon, the Trebia River ran red with the blood of an army that never had a chance. Most people who discuss Trebia focus on Hannibal's tactical genius in the moment. The cavalry, the ambush, the timing. Military historians have done the same for centuries. What they miss is the deeper layer. Trebia was not a tactical masterpiece improvised on the morning of battle. It was the culmination of a psychological operation that Hannibal had been running against the Roman commander for days. He did not just set a physical trap, he set a trap inside his enemy's mind. And by the time Tiberius Sempronius Longus finally committed his army to crossing a freezing river before breakfast on a December morning, starving, hypothermic, and furious, Hannibal already knew exactly how the day would end. Before we go through every decision, every maneuver, every moment of this battle from the hours before dawn to the last Roman who made it across the river alive, if you are the kind of person who wants the real story of history, the tactics, the terrain, the genius, and the catastrophic human cost behind the legend, hit that subscribe button and come with us. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from, because this story deserves to be told properly. And that is exactly what we are going to do. To understand the Trebia, you have to understand the situation Hannibal was in when he arrived in northern Italy in the autumn of 218 BC. He had just done something that most modern military strategists still consider borderline insane. He had crossed the Alps in late October with an army, with cavalry horses, with war elephants. The numbers tell you everything about what the crossing cost him. He had left Carthagena in the spring with approximately 90,000 men. He crossed the Pyrenees with 50,000. He crossed the Rhone with 38,000. When he descended from the Alps into the Po Valley and took stock of what remained, he had approximately 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a collection of war elephants that had already begun dying from the cold and altitude. He had lost more than half his army to mountain passes, avalanche ambush by alpine tribes, disease, desertion, and the simple grinding attrition of one of the most brutal marches in recorded military history. By any reasonable strategic analysis, this force should not have been capable of threatening Rome. A Roman army could field equivalent numbers in a single recruitment cycle. Rome had allies across the Italian peninsula who could provide tens of thousands more. Hannibal was operating 800 miles from his nearest supply base in Spain, in hostile territory, with no reinforcements available and no clear path to resupply. The logical move, the move any rational commander would have made, was to winter in northern Italy, rebuild strength, recruit from the Gallic tribes who hated Roman domination, and plan for a long campaign. Hannibal did this. But he understood something about the strategic situation that made simple survival insufficient. He was not in Italy to raid. He was not in Italy to hold territory. He was in Italy to break Rome's alliance system, to demonstrate, with overwhelming force, that the Latin allies in the Italian Confederate States had backed the wrong power and would be better served changing sides. To do that, he needed to destroy Roman armies in the field, visibly and catastrophically, before Rome could replace them. Every month he spent recuperating was a month Rome spent mobilizing. He could not afford to wait. And so, within weeks of descending from the Alps, still nursing an army that was malnourished, exhausted, and depleted, Hannibal went looking for a fight. He found the conditions he needed at the Ticinus River in November 218 BC in a cavalry engagement against a Roman force under the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, the father of the man who would eventually destroy Hannibal's career at Zama, though that story was still 17 years away. The Ticinus was not a major battle, it was a skirmish, really. But Hannibal's Numidian cavalry shattered the Roman horsemen with brutal efficiency. And Scipio himself was wounded badly enough that his army was forced to withdraw south to the Po River and then further south to the Trebia, where they established a fortified camp on the eastern bank. Here is where the story gets complicated. Here is where something happened that almost nobody talks about when they discuss the lead up to Trebia. Something that turned a strategic retreat into a strategic catastrophe. Scipio had been wounded. His army had been beaten. He was cautious, conservative, and fully aware that his opponent was not someone to be engaged without careful preparation. His instinct was to wait, to fortify, to rebuild, to coordinate with the other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, who was sailing north from Sicily with a second Roman army after being recalled from a planned invasion of Africa. Wait for reinforcements, consolidate, and do not give Hannibal the engagement he wanted on ground of his choosing. This was correct. This was exactly the right analysis. Scipio understood what Hannibal needed and was determined not to give it to him. But Scipio was not in command anymore. He was wounded, bedridden, barely functional. Command had effectively passed to Longus, and Tiberius Sempronius Longus was a different kind of man entirely. Longus was not stupid. This point matters because the temptation in hindsight is to dismiss him as simply arrogant or reckless. And the historical record is richer than that. He was experienced, he was competent, he had handled the Sicilian operations with reasonable effectiveness. But he was operating under a pressure that had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with Roman politics. His consulship was expiring in a matter of weeks. The new consuls would be elected in January. And Longus had arrived in northern Italy, having missed the entire Alpine campaign, having missed the Ticinus River, having contributed nothing yet to the defense of Italy. If there was going to be a decisive engagement against the Carthaginian invader, and there clearly was going to be one whether he fought it or waited, Tiberius Sempronius Longus wanted to be the man who won it. He needed a victory. He needed it before January. And Hannibal, who understood Roman political culture with the precision of a man who had studied his enemy for decades, knew exactly what that meant. The Gallic tribes of the Po Valley had been Rome's subjects for less than a generation, and they were unreliable. Hannibal had been actively recruiting them since his arrival, and significant numbers had already joined his force. He now had perhaps 38,000 men, not the full strength of his Spanish invasion army, but substantially rebuilt through Gallic recruitment. More importantly, his Numidian cavalry remained the finest light horsemen in the Mediterranean world, and he had a force of roughly 10,000 horsemen to the Romans' 4,000. On flat ground in open battle, that advantage would be decisive. What he needed was to get Longus to commit on flat ground in open battle before the Roman commander had fully assessed the tactical situation. And Hannibal, who was patient in the way that only truly dangerous men can be patient, spent the days before Trebia setting the conditions for exactly that. He began with a raid. On a morning in mid-December, Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry across the Trebia River to attack Roman foraging parties on the western bank. This was not an accident. It was not opportunistic aggression. It was a deliberate provocation, calculated to produce a specific response. The Numidians struck fast, caused casualties, and retreated. A Roman force sent to drive them off found itself in a running skirmish that drew it further from camp, exposed and overextended. The Romans suffered. They withdrew. They reported to Longus. Scipio counseled restraint. Longus overruled him. But Hannibal was not finished. The raid had accomplished two things simultaneously. It had tested Longus's temperament, confirming that the Roman consul would commit troops in response to provocation, and it had begun creating a specific emotional state in the Roman camp. Frustration, offense, the sense that Hannibal's men were moving freely on Roman-controlled territory, harassing Roman soldiers, and getting away with it. This emotional pressure would accumulate over the following days. Meanwhile, Hannibal walked the ground. He walked it personally, in the way that great commanders have always walked ground before committing men to it. The Trebia River ran roughly south to north through the Po Valley, its current cold and fast in December, its banks variable, shallower in some places, deeper in others. The western plain was flat farmland, ideal for cavalry. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that would mark it as exceptional terrain. But there was a dry stream bed running perpendicular to the Trebia, cutting through a low-lying area thick with scrub and tall reeds. It was not visible from the Roman camp. It was not the kind of feature that appeared on any strategic map. It was nothing, a seasonal drainage channel, the kind of minor geographical detail that commanders at the scale of army operations never bothered to note. Hannibal noted it. He called for his younger brother. Mago Barca was 22 years old, experienced, trusted, and capable of independent action. Hannibal explained what he needed. Mago would take 1,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, picked men the best available, and move into that stream bed before dawn on the morning of battle. They would lie in the reeds through the night. They would be cold, cramped, miserable. They would not move, would not make noise, would not give any sign of their presence. And when the battle reached its critical point, they would emerge and attack the Roman rear. Mago agreed. The details were arranged, the timing was established. Then Hannibal went back to his camp and fed his men. This detail matters more than almost anything else about what happened at Trebia, and it is consistently underemphasized in popular accounts of the battle. On the night before the engagement, Hannibal ordered every man in his army to eat a full meal. He distributed food specifically for this purpose. He had fires built throughout the camp, and he ordered his men to oil their bodies and warm their limbs before the dawn. He knew what the morning would require. He was ensuring his army would be physically ready for it. The Roman camp, 3 miles away on the eastern bank, had no such order. The Roman foraging situation had been poor for days, partly because Hannibal's cavalry had been disrupting it. The men were short on food, and on the morning of December 218 BC, they would receive none before going into battle. Hannibal sent the Numidians at dawn. It was before sunrise, the coldest part of a December morning in northern Italy. The Numidian cavalry crossed the Trebia and rode directly to the edge of the Roman camp, shouting, loosing arrows, making as much noise and disturbance as possible. It was the same provocation as before, only more direct, more aggressive, more insulting. They were not raiding the periphery, they were at the gate. Inside the Roman camp, Longus was awake in moments. He had been waiting for exactly this, an engagement, a victory, a chance to write his consulship into the history of Rome's defense against the Carthaginian invasion. He did not call a council. He did not wait for scouts to report on the ground. He ordered his army to form up in advance. The Romans crossed the Trebia in December, in the morning before breakfast, in water that reached their chests. Imagine that crossing. You have not eaten. The air temperature is at or below freezing. You step into a river running down from the Alps, cold enough to cause physical shock on contact. You are carrying armor, weapons, a shield that weighs twice as much wet as dry. The current pushes against your legs. The riverbed is uneven stone and gravel. Men slip, men struggle. The water comes to your waist, then your chest. By the time you emerge on the western bank, your lower body is numb. Your hands are losing sensation. You are shaking uncontrollably. And across the plain, 3 miles away, Hannibal's army is waiting, fed, oiled, warm, and fully rested. The Romans formed up on the western bank. There were approximately 40,000 of them. 16,000 Roman legionaries, around 20,000 Latin and Italian allied infantry, and 4,000 cavalry distributed on both flanks. They outnumbered Hannibal's forces. They were professional soldiers. They were, by any conventional measure, a formidable army. They were also hypothermic, starving, and furious. Longus had ordered them into the river, and they had gone, because Roman legionaries followed orders. But fury is not a military asset. Fury makes soldiers push forward when they should consolidate. Fury makes men take ground without securing their flanks. And Longus's army, by the time it formed up in battle order west of the Trebia, was running on rage and adrenaline in bodies that had been physically compromised before the first contact. The Numidians, their provocation complete, withdrew. They circled back to the Carthaginian lines, rejoining Hannibal's cavalry on both flanks. Hannibal's force was arranged in its standard deep formation. African and Spanish veterans in the center, Gallic infantry on either side of the center, his formidable cavalry massed on both flanks, and the remaining war elephants positioned at the ends of the line. He had approximately 38,000 men against Rome's 40,000. On paper, it was close. On the ground, it was not close at all. The Romans advanced. They had no choice. They could not stand still in those temperatures without the physical situation deteriorating further. Forward was the only option. Longus ordered his velites, the light skirmishers who led Roman advances, forward, and they went. And here is where the first thing went wrong. The first domino in a sequence that would collapse with absolute precision over the next 6 hours. The velites were already depleted. They had spent their javelins in the initial skirmishing with the Numidians. They advanced against Hannibal's Balearic slingers and Numidian light infantry, men who were fresh, warm, and had full equipment. The velites took heavy casualties and fell back. Before the Roman heavy infantry had even made contact, the screening force that was supposed to protect the main line's advance had been functionally destroyed. Then the cavalry battle began. Hannibal had 10,000 horsemen. Rome had 4,000. Even if they had been equal in skill and equally rested, the numbers would have decided it. They were not equal in anything. The Roman cavalry on both flanks was struck almost simultaneously by superior Carthaginian and Numidian horse, and the results were swift and catastrophic. The right flank cavalry broke first, then the left. Within an extraordinarily short time, by the standards of ancient battle, both Roman cavalry wings had been driven from the field. This is the moment that decided the battle, not the infantry engagement in the center. That would take hours, and the Roman legionaries would fight with genuine courage and skill. The cavalry decision was the trap closing, because with no horsemen of their own, the Roman infantry had no protection on either flank. And Hannibal's cavalry, having destroyed its Roman counterpart, was now free to do whatever Hannibal needed it to do. What it needed to do was swing inward and attack the Roman flanks from behind. But the Roman infantry did not know this yet. The legionaries in the center were fighting hard, pushing into Hannibal's line with the disciplined grinding pressure that Roman infantry trained for their entire careers to deliver. And Hannibal's center, his Gallic infantry, deliberately placed there because they were his least reliable troops, was giving ground. Slowly, grudgingly, but giving ground. The Romans were pushing forward. Men could feel it. The enemy was retreating. The Roman infantry began to believe they were winning. They were not winning. They were being guided. Hannibal had placed the Gauls in the center, knowing they would bend. He had placed his best African veterans, the men who had crossed the Alps, the survivors of a dozen engagements, soldiers who had been fighting under Barca generals since they were teenagers, on the outer edges of his infantry line, angled slightly inward. As the Roman center pushed forward and the Gallic line bent, the African veterans on either side were not retreating. They were pivoting. They were turning to face inward, toward the flanks of the Roman advance. The Roman legionaries, pushing deep into the Carthaginian center in pursuit of what they thought was a collapsing enemy line, were walking into a closing jaw. Then, Mago came out of the reeds. 2,000 men, infantry and cavalry, who had spent the night motionless in a frozen streambed, emerged behind the Roman army at the moment of maximum commitment. The Romans were deep in the Carthaginian center. their flanks exposed, their cavalry gone, and now there was a fresh force hitting them from behind. There was no reserve to respond. There was no cavalry to countercharge. There was nowhere to go. The Roman line did not break immediately. This matters. The legionaries of 218 BC were not the kind of men who simply collapsed and ran when surprised. They had been trained too well for that, conditioned by years of drill to hold formation even under catastrophic pressure. What actually happened was something grimmer than a rout. It was a slow compression. The Roman center was pushed from the front by Hannibal's veterans, compressed from both sides by cavalry sweeping in from the flanks, and struck from behind by Mago's force. The formation lost cohesion degree by degree, the way a structure fails, not all at once, but progressively, each failure making the next more likely. In the center, something remarkable happened. Approximately 10,000 Roman legionaries, a substantial block of the central force, maintained enough unit cohesion to do what Roman infantry training was designed to enable. They pushed, straight through. They drove through the weakening Gallic center, broke out the far side of the Carthaginian line, and began marching toward Placentia, the Roman town to the north. They did not run, they marched in formation, and they made it, but everyone else did not. On both flanks, the Roman allied infantry, the Latin and Italian Confederate soldiers who made up half the army, were caught between the closing cavalry and the inward pivoting African veterans. The war elephants added chaos on the edges of the battlefield, terrifying horses and disrupting any attempt at organized withdrawal. Men who had been fighting in freezing temperatures since before dawn, who had crossed a chest-deep river without eating, who had now been fighting for hours. These men broke. And when they broke, they ran for the only place they could go, the Trebia River. The Trebia, which they had crossed that morning in the cold, was now between them and safety. They ran for it. The Numidian cavalry ran after them. What followed was not a battle. It was a pursuit. Men who had dropped their shields to run faster were caught on the bank, cut down in the shallows, driven into the deeper water, and drowned. The river that Hannibal had used as a weapon in the morning, the cold and the crossing, the hypothermia and the empty stomachs, was now a death trap for the men fleeing toward it. By early afternoon, it was over. 20,000 Romans and allies were dead. More had drowned in the river. The 10,000 who had broken through the center were safe in Placentia, but they had broken through not one. They were survivors, not victors. Longus led what remained of his force back across the Trebia and sent a report to Rome. He wrote that the battle had been interrupted by a storm. He had not been defeated by a storm. He had been destroyed by a man who understood him better than he understood himself. What Hannibal built at the Trebia was not primarily a tactical system. It was a psychological one. Every element of his preparation, the raids that built frustration in the Roman camp, the timing that forced a river crossing at dawn in December, the deliberate withholding of battle until the Romans had been physically compromised, the placement of the ambush force days before the engagement, was designed to operate on the Roman commander's psychology as much as on his army's body. Hannibal could not know for certain that Longus would cross the Trebia on that particular morning. What he could know, because he had watched Longus's responses to the earlier provocations, because he understood what political pressure does to military decision-making, because he had spent his entire adult life studying the Romans. Was that a Roman consul with an expiring term and a wounded co-commander and a desperate need for a victory would eventually stop being careful? The cold, the hunger, the Numidian taunts at the camp gate, these were not simply tactical preparations. They were inputs into a system designed to push a man past his threshold of caution and into impulsive action. Hannibal did not need Longus to be stupid. He needed him to be human. After the battle, Hannibal released the non-Roman prisoners, the Gallic, Latin, and Italian allied soldiers, without ransom. He fed them. He spoke to them personally through interpreters. He told them he had not come to fight the Italian peoples. He had come to fight Rome. He had come to free them from Roman domination. He would not be their enemy if they chose not to be his. This was not generosity. It was strategy. Rome's power rested on the loyalty of the Italian Confederation, The Latin allies, the Samnites, the Campanians, the dozens of smaller peoples who provided soldiers and supplies to Roman armies. If those allies could be peeled away, Rome's military capacity would collapse. The Trebia had proven that a Carthaginian army could destroy Roman forces in open battle. The released prisoners were the message. They went home to their communities carrying Hannibal's words and, more importantly, carrying the memory of what they had seen at the Trebia. Some of them would remember it at Cannae 2 years later, when enough Italian allies switched sides to change the strategic balance of the war entirely. The Roman Senate, when news arrived, did not panic. This is important to understand about Rome in 218 BC. They had survived crises before: the Gallic sack of the city in 390 BC, wars against the Samnites, the difficult campaigns of the Pyrrhic War. They had institutional responses to catastrophe. They held elections. They appointed new consuls. They began preparing new armies. They enacted emergency measures to accelerate recruitment and supply. They were, in their deliberate and procedural way, already working on the problem. What Rome could not yet understand, what it would take 2 more catastrophic defeats to teach them, and even then the lesson would only be partly learned, was that the problem was not tactical. They could train more legionaries, they could replace the cavalry, they could winter in fortified camps and refuse engagement until they had prepared more carefully. All of this they did. And at Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, Hannibal killed 15,000 of them in another ambush. This one along a lakeside road in Etruria, in a fog so thick that soldiers could not see 10 feet. And at Cannae in 216 BC, he killed 70,000 in a single afternoon, the most devastating defeat Rome ever suffered. Using the same double envelopment principle he had first fully articulated at the Trebia, the Romans kept not understanding. They kept producing armies, keep replacing losses, kept applying tactical solutions to what was actually a strategic problem. How do you fight a commander who uses your own discipline against you? How do you respond to an opponent who treats every one of your strengths as a vulnerability to be exploited? The Romans eventually figured it out, but it took them 15 years, and it required a general, the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, the teenager who had supposedly rescued his wounded father at the Ticinus, who was willing to learn from Hannibal rather than simply try harder to defeat him by doing what Roman armies always did. Scipio took Hannibal's methods. The flanking cavalry, the deliberate creation of tactical traps, the understanding that winning a battle begins days before the first contact. He took those methods to Africa and used them against Hannibal's own army at Zama in 202 BC. And Hannibal, fighting without his Numidian cavalry, Massinissa had switched sides, lost for the first and only time in his career. But all of that was still far away on that December morning at the Trebia. What existed in 218 BC was a freezing river, a Roman army crossing it without breakfast in the dark, and a Carthaginian general standing on the western bank watching them come, already knowing where every man would be at every moment of the next 6 hours. He had planned it in a frozen stream bed with his brother. He had planned it in the days of Numidian raids that pushed Longus's patience past its limit. He had planned it in the rations he distributed the night before, in the oil rubbed into his soldiers' limbs against the cold, in the gap between his army's physical readiness and Rome's. He had planned all of it, and it worked exactly as he planned. 20,000 Romans died at the Trebia, not because Hannibal was luckier, not because the Romans were cowards, and not because Carthaginian soldiers were individually superior to Roman legionaries. They died because one man understood that a battle is won in the mind before it is won in the field. Because one man recognized that the most powerful army in the world had a vulnerability: its political culture, its rigid command structures, its inability to separate military decision-making from personal ambition, and designed a trap around that vulnerability with the patience and precision of someone who had been studying his enemies since childhood. He was 29 years old at the Trebia. He had been at war for 11 years. He would not lose a battle for another 19. Rome called him the enemy. They were right. He was the most dangerous enemy they ever faced, not because of what he did to their armies, but because of what he understood about them, the thing they did not yet understand about themselves. That discipline without adaptability is not strength. It is a locked door. And Hannibal, standing on the western bank of the Trebia River in December 218 BC, had found the key before the Romans even knew the door existed. The river ran red by noon, and Hannibal Barca began preparing for Trasimene.